The wind rolled through the prairie like a restless spirit, tugging at skirts and stirring dust devils across the dry earth. And that was when she said it, standing there beneath a sky stretched wide and merciless, her fingers twisted in the worn fabric of her dress. "I ain't pretty enough for you," she said, her voice thin as a creek in drought, and the words seemed to hang between them heavier than a loaded rifle. But the cowboy in front of her did not flinch, did not sigh, did not turn away. Instead, he tipped his hat back and let out a low, surprised laugh that rumbled from deep in his chest. Clara May had grown up believing mirrors told the truth and whispers carried more weight than church bells. She had heard the other girls talk about her plain brown hair and sun-freckled cheeks, about how her hands were too rough from work and her boots too scuffed to ever catch a man who owned more than a mule and a broken fence. And she carried those whispers like stones in her apron pocket, heavy and always knocking against her ribs. So when she stood in front of Thomas Hale with the golden evening light catching in his dark hair and the smell of leather and horse clinging to him, she figured she was saving herself the heartbreak by speaking first. Thomas Hale was not a man known for laughing easy. Folks in town said he had eyes like storm clouds gathering over open land, quiet and dangerous and deep. He had ridden into Red Hollow 3 winters back with nothing but a saddlebag and a past he never shared, bought himself a stretch of stubborn land no one else wanted, and worked it with a patience that could tame even the wildest colt. And now he stood before Clara May with that same patience settling into his shoulders, listening to her words like they were something fragile instead of foolish. "You're everything I prayed for," he said after the laughter faded, his voice low and steady as a river cutting through stone. And Clara blinked at him as if he had spoken a foreign tongue, because no one had ever prayed for her before. Not that she knew of. She had prayed herself plenty of nights, prayed for rain, for her pox cough to ease, for the debt collector to forget their door, but never once had she imagined a man kneeling somewhere under the same sky, asking the good Lord for a girl with wind, tangled hair and stubborn prides. The prairie seemed to hush around them, even the cicadas quieting as though they too wanted to hear what came next. Thomas stepped closer, boots pressing firm into the dust, and he reached for her hands without asking, his palms calloused and warm, fitting around hers like they belonged there. "I didn't ask for a porcelain doll," he said, his thumb brushing across the scrape on her knuckle from mending fence that morning. "I asked for a woman who could stand beside me when the cattle wander and the storms come down hard. I asked for someone who wouldn't scare easy at thunder or trouble." And Clara felt her breath hitch, because that sounded less like flattery and more like truth. She searched his face for mockery and found none, only sincerity etched in lines carved by sun and wind. She remembered the first time she saw him at the watering trough outside town, sleeves rolled high and muscles flexing as he hauled bucket after bucket for Mrs. Dalloway's horses without being asked. She had thought him stern and unreachable, a man carved from the same rock as the canyon cliffs, but she had also seen the way he handed a coin to a barefoot boy who had dropped his apple in the dirt, had seen the gentleness and the way he righted a fallen bird's nest from the porch beam of the saloon. And those small kindnesses had planted seeds in her heart she had tried hard to ignore. Pretty fades when the drought hits. Thomas went on, his gaze steady on hers. "But grit don't, faith don't, kindness sure as hell don't." He caught himself and tipped his hat again, as if apologizing to heaven for the language, and Clara felt a reluctant smile tug at her lips despite the ache that still lingered. She had spent years believing she needed softer features or lighter eyes to earn a man's affection. Yet here stood one telling her the very things she tried to hide were the reasons he chose her, and that thought frightened her more than rejection ever could. The sun dipped lower, painting the world in amber and shadow, and somewhere in the distance a lone coyote called out across the open land. Clara swallowed hard and squeezed his hands back, her heart pounding like hooves against hard ground. She was not suddenly transformed into a woman free of doubt. The whispers of her past did not vanish with a single confession, but something shifted inside her chest, something steady and warm taking root where insecurity once reigned. And as Thomas pulled her gently toward him, resting his forehead against hers beneath the endless western sky, she realized that maybe beauty was not a thing measured by town gossip or mirror glass. Maybe it was measured by the way a man looked at you like you were the answer to a prayer whispered into the lonely Dartha. Next morning broke sharp and blue over Red Hollow, but peace on the prairie never lasted long. By noon a rider came tearing down the main road, dust flying behind him like smoke from a gun barrel. shouting that half the cattle had busted through the north fence during the night storm. And Clara felt the old doubt flicker again as Thomas tightened the cinch on his saddle. She knew ranch work was no place for a woman who questioned her worth. Yet when he looked at her and said, "Ride with me," there wasn't a trace of hesitation in his voice. Only trust. They rode hard across the open land, wind cutting against their faces. Thunderheads still lurking low on the horizon like unfinished business. The broken fence lay twisted and splintered, and beyond it, scattered cattle moved, restless and wide. Clara swung down from her horse before Thomas could offer a hand. Boots hitting dirt firm and sure, she grabbed coil and hammer from the saddle pack, her braid whipping against her back as she moved. And though sweat gathered at her temples, she worked without complaint, because proving herself was no longer about town whispers. It was about the man beside her, and the life they were building. Trouble did not come only in the shape of storms. By late afternoon another rider appeared on the ridge, tall in the saddle, coat black and sharp as a blade. It was Silas Crowe, the wealthiest landowner in 3 counties, and the same man who once hinted Clara would do better marrying comfort instead of hardship. He had asked for her hand the previous spring with a smile too thin to be kind, and when she refused him, he had ridden off with a promise that she would regret choosing dirt over silk. Now his gaze swept over her as she hammered fence posts, and his smirk cut deeper than barbed wire. Still playing ranch hand, Silas called, reining his horse closer. "You could have had a house in town, mirrors from back east, dresses fit for a governor's ball." Clara straightened slowly, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist. She felt the sting of his words because once upon a time she had wondered if he was right, if maybe choosing Thomas meant choosing a life too hard for someone like her. But before she could answer, Thomas stepped forward, calm as ever, his voice steady. "She chose a life that means something." And the silence that followed was heavier than any insults. Silas laughed low and mocking, but there was something uneasy behind it. Perhaps it was the way Clara did not shrink under his gaze anymore. Perhaps it was the way Thomas stood, not in front of her to shield, but beside her to stand equal. "Meaning don't pay debts," Silas said, "and this land's been late on payment twice." The words landed like a warning shot. Clara's stomach tightened. She knew the numbers, knew the cattle loss from winter had cost them dearly, and fear brushed cold fingers along her spine after Silas rode off, leaving dust and tension in his wake. Clara turned to Thomas. "Maybe he's right," she admitted softly, hating the tremor in her voice. "Maybe I ain't enough to help you hold this place together." The confession tasted bitter, because it was not only about money, it was about the deep-rooted belief that she brought more burden than blessing. Thomas reached for her shoulders, firm but gentle, forcing her to meet his eyes. "Listen to me," he said, voice roughened, not by anger but by urgency. "You think I prayed for easy?" He shook his head slow. "I prayed for strength, for a partner who would fight beside me, not someone who'd run when a rich man waved comfort in her face." He brushed a stray strand of hair from her cheek, fingers lingering as if memorizing her. "This land may test us, but I ain't fighting for dirt alone. I'm fighting for the woman who stood in the dust yesterday and mended fence like she'd been born to it." That evening they sat on the porch watching the sun sink behind the low hills, exhaustion weighing on their bones, but something steadier settling between them. Clara leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and for the first time she understood that beauty had never been the currency that mattered here. Loyalty was, grit was, love forged in hardship was. And as the first stars blinked awake above the prairie, she realized storms would come, debts might threaten, and men like Silas would always measure worth in gold. But Thomas measured hers in faith, and that was something no rival could ever buy. The reckoning came quicker than either of them expected. 3 days after Silas Crowe's warning, a letter arrived, folded stiff and official, stamped with the county seal and smelling faintly of ink and trouble. The debt would be called in full within 30 days. No extensions, no mercy. Clara read the words twice and felt the air thin in her lungs. She had known hardship, had known hunger and cold mornings, but this was different. This threatened to pull the very ground from beneath their boots. Thomas stood quiet beside her, jaw tight, not defeated but calculating, like a man studying the horizon before a storm breaks. That night, the wind rose wild and restless, rattling shutters and carrying the scent of distant rain. Clara lay awake, staring at the ceiling beams, listening to Thomas breathe slow and steady beside her. She turned toward him in the darkness and whispered what she had been afraid to say aloud. "If you'd chosen someone prettier, someone with a dowry or land, You wouldn't be facing this." The words felt foolish even as they slipped free. But fear has a way of dragging old insecurities back to life. Thomas opened his eyes. Even in the dim light, she could see the steel in them. "You still don't see it," he murmured, propping himself on one elbow, his voice low but fierce as a banked fire. "I ain't losing this land because of you, and I sure as hell ain't measuring my blessings in coin." He reached for her hand, pressing it against his chest, where his heart beat strong and certain. "This right here is what I prayed for. A woman who worries over our future instead of chasing comfort. A woman who stands in storms instead of hiding from them." His thumb brushed the curve of her cheek, and though the wind howled outside, inside that small room she felt something anchored deep. Morning brought, not sunlight, but dust. Riders cresting the ridge in a line that sent Clara's pulse racing. For a moment, she feared Silas had come to claim what he believed already his. But as the figures drew closer, she recognized neighbors. Mrs. Dalloway's eldest boy, the Miller twins, old Jonah Pike with his crooked hat. They dismounted one by one in the yard, boots thudding against earth. Thomas stepped forward, wary but composed, and Jonah cleared his throat. "Heard about the debt," he said gruffly. "Figured it's time we paid back the man who hauled water in drought and fixed fences that weren't his." Clara stood stunned as sacks of feed, spare lumber, and even a small lockbox of collected coins were laid out on the porch. It was not riches, not enough to erase every worry, but it was proof of something far greater than gold. Thomas had not built only fences and barns these past years. He had built loyalty. He had sown kindness across Red Hollow, and now it returned like rain on thirsty soil. Clara felt tears sting her eyes, not from fear this time, but from understanding. She had thought beauty was what won a man's devotion, yet it was character that won a community's faith. By afternoon Silas Crowe himself rode up, his expression sharp as ever, but the sight before him shifted something in his posture. Neighbors hammering new boards into place, cattle being driven back proper. Clara standing tall beside Thomas with sleeves rolled and chin lifted. Silas's gaze lingered on her, perhaps searching for the insecure girl he once tried to sway, but he found no trace of her. "Seems you've gathered quite a defense," he said coolly. Thomas met his eyes steady. "Seems we ain't as alone as you figured." The silence stretched taut, as rope between them in the end. Silas tipped his hat with a reluctant nod. Pride warring with practicality. "You've got 30 more days," he said. "After that, we'll see." It was not victory. Not yet. But it was breathing room, and sometimes breathing room is all a determined heart requires. As he rode off, Clara felt Thomas's hand slip into hers, fingers lacing tight. She squeezed back not out of fear, but out of shared resolve, because she understood now that this fight was not his alone to carry. That evening the prairie glowed gold beneath a clearing sky. Clara stood at the fence line watching cattle settle calm in the pasture. Thomas came up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, resting his chin atop her head. "Still think you ain't pretty enough," he teased gently, and she laughed, soft. The sound carried warm on the breeze. "Maybe I ain't the kind folks put in paintings," she admitted, turning in his arms, "but I reckon I'm strong enough for storms." Thomas smiled, brushing a kiss across her sun-freckled forehead. "You're everything I prayed for," he said again, and this time she believed him, not because he spoke the words, but because together they had weathered wind, doubt, and threat, and found that love built on grit and faith shines brighter than any polished beauty ever could.